And welcome to Unlock the Door with your host, Michael Cross, here, and hopefully giving you an exciting hour of analysis into current issues and politics and whatever is out there that impacts on our society today. What I'd like to start out with is, asking people, what do they know about the term ADHD? Well, we're going to have an expert tonight that's going to talk about ADHD and what it's all about, and maybe give us some perspectives that could assist you if you are a parent, a grandparent, someday to be a parent, or just if you work with kids in any way. So I'm going to introduce, or welcome, I should say, Marilyn Wedge. Are you there, Marilyn?
Yes, I am, Michael.
Excellent, excellent. Well, I'm going to mostly turn this over to you because you're the expert on this. And tell the audience a little bit about yourself.
Thank you, Michael. It's my pleasure to be on your show. Well, I am a family therapist. I have been a family therapist for 23 years, specializing in children and teenagers. And I'm here in Westlake Village, California. And I have written 2 books in the field of family therapy. My most recent one was published last year called Pills Are Not for Preschoolers, a drug-free approach for troubled kids. And I wrote that book because I wanted to give parents an alternative to drug treatment for their children's problems. As far as my credentials, I have taught at the California State University in the East Bay. I have a doctorate from the University of Chicago, and I was a postdoctoral fellow at the Hastings Center for Bioethics in New York.
Oh, very impressive. So, it seems that you wrote an article, it was published last year in Psychology Today, and could you tell the audience a little bit about the article, how popular it seems to have been, and so forth?
Well, yeah, the article is called Why French Kids Don't Have ADHD. And as of today, it has 3 million readers worldwide. It's just thrilling that it's on websites in Romania and Argentina and France. It's been translated into French, and it's on a German website. And it seems to have struck a nerve with people because the rate in which children are being diagnosed with ADHD is going up. Not only in this country, but also in some other countries in Europe. And when I first wrote the article, I was interviewed by a radio station in Ireland because they had suddenly begun to see an explosion of ADHD cases in Ireland. So what inspired me to write this article was I noticed that the rate of ADHD in this country was at that time 6-7%. Today it's 11% of children diagnosed with ADHD. And I started to look around and I hit on France because there was data available for the number of diagnoses. And in France, the ADHD diagnosis is only 0.5%. So a child in the United States is 22 times more likely to be diagnosed with ADHD than a child in France. So I began to look into it. I began to do some research, and I found that French child psychiatry does not use the same manual or criteria for the diagnosis of ADHD that American child psychiatrists use. And in France, it's much more difficult. The criteria are much narrower. And so children are rarely diagnosed with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. The other thing I found, besides the difference in French psychiatry, was that French culture, there are cultural factors in France that are very different from the United States. The amount of TV a child watches in France is much less. The child's life is more structured. They have a particular bedtime. They have meals at particular times, and they're not allowed to open a bag of cheesy snacks in the middle of the afternoon. They need to wait for their meals. Their food is a lot healthier. They have healthy, nutritious meals with fresh fruit and fresh vegetables, with fish. And whereas in the United States, children can eat whenever they want. They snack. A lot of families have dinners in front of the TV set. There's not a lot of structure. I also found that French ways of disciplining are different. They tend to be more stricter with children. The expectations are more clearly set out. And they have a kind of structure, which they call a cadre, for children's lives. Whereas in America, the lives are very unstructured. They can do what they want when they want. So these two things, these two factors, child psychiatry and the way they see childhood problems, and cultural differences, including food and media exposure, are very different. And that's what I contrast in the article.
Okay, so in other words, French kids don't get up in the morning and have a sugar-enhanced cereal breakfast, a muffin, and a Mountain Dew, and when they get home, watch 6 hours of the Disney Network.
That's right, Michael. They do not. They have healthy, nutritious breakfasts, and I think it's interesting in that the Pamela Druckerman's books, Bringing Up Bébé and Bébé Day by Day, and the kind of meals that children have for breakfast are healthy meals. They have fruit and cheese and bread and milk. None of this Pop-Tarts, quick sugary snacks. So it's just a very different way of thinking about what's good for children.
Huh. Well, I've worked in American schools before, and the interesting thing is the lunches are also very, very, I don't know where they get this food. It must be through some sort of USDA program or something where, I think it's frozen. We used to joke about it in high school that it was frozen leftovers from, the civil defense program of the 50s. But the thing is that there's lots of grease and breading and just really not very nutritious food. And when I got to high school, the people that really wanted nutrition would actually hop in the car and go down to the local Dairy Queen to get some hamburgers or something, because the food at the school was so lousy. Even the teachers would go down to Dairy Queen to get something to eat. Because again, it was just, I don't know if there's a direct connection, but I will say that if you eat something that's not very good and it has a lot of calories and you're not moving and you're basically told to sit still for an hour and listen to a lecture on, I don't know, what could be interesting for one person could be uninteresting to another. So you're likely to have at least a few classes that are going to be very boring for you. And if you've got all of your insulin levels are going through the chart, you've got all this energy that nature tells us we should be using. I think even if you were talking about people in a nursing home, they would be getting a little bit anxious and maybe not wanting to concentrate.
Well, I agree with you totally. French children, some of the examples of food that they have for lunch are fish, they have salmon, they have turkey, they have haddock, and with broccoli or spinach, zucchini, and then they have cheese, and they have healthy desserts like banana rhubarb compote or fresh kiwi fruit. And so there's a real difference in the culture. And, I was able to look up, there has been some research about fish oil, omega-3 fatty acids, And some pediatricians, even in this country, prescribe omega-3 fatty acids for children. The old-fashioned remedy of cod liver oil, it calms children down. So it's one alternative treatment. But I think lunches high in fish, high in protein, high in vegetables and fruit is something we don't have in the United States in schools.
Well, we had a budget director back in the 80s who said that ketchup was a vegetable. And so you're saying that maybe a meal of fish sticks and tater tots, everyone that's from America knows what a tater tot is probably not as good for you as maybe having a meal with salad and some salmon.
Exactly. Salad, salmon, broccoli, and if they have desserts, but they have fresh strawberries or fresh fruit and cheese. It's a whole different culture of eating. And, in France, not to idealize it, there's a lot of antidepressant use among adults in France. But for children, they're very strict about what foods are marketed to children. And they're extremely strict about what preservatives or additives are allowed in foods. There are very few. So France regulates food much more strictly than the United States.
Well, I will note that there has been connections to nutrition, because I know there must be some people out there thinking, okay, now this is getting into the whole nutrition thing and organic foods and whatever. But I will note that I read an article sometime back that was saying that, at least when I read the article, that Iranian males, teenagers, go through puberty later than would be expected for their standard of living. And they looked into it and found out that it was a lack of zinc in the diet, which meant that there was a lack of, zinc is necessary for the production of testosterone. And so you had just this little nutritional factor that was missing in a diet in a region that affected puberty and when the onset of puberty would be. And we've seen lots of articles that deal with the idea that the higher the amount of basically overnutrition in the United States has pushed women going through puberty much lower. So if there's an effect on our sexual organs dealing, when we are getting too much or too little of a nutrient, the brain is ultimately an organ as well.
Sure. Well, that's a very interesting point. And you can't help thinking about the growth hormones that are used in cattle in the United States, and the milk produced from those cows have growth hormones in them. So it makes sense that they would affect the body that eats them.
Yeah, for my European listeners, in the United States, there is, and this has been in the last 10 or 15 years, there has been an incredible increase in the amount of corn syrup added to just about everything. On top of that, there has been a lot more. Much more of the meat is coming from factory farms, which you have pigs and cows don't even have the room to turn around as they're growing up. And of course, this increases disease, which means you give a lot of antibiotics, you give a lot of growth hormones too. Well, there's probably some of that's going to leach into the food you're eating. So at least in Europe, well, I don't know, maybe Britain and Ireland, they're more like the United States. But when it comes to Scandinavia, Russia, Central Europe, you don't have as much of this. It's very highly regulated, and it hasn't seemed to encroach in yet. So I just wanted to point that out.
Well, I think that's a really good point. And I think that if we did not have a strict biological model of the causality of these health problems or mental health problems in children, there could be more research, productive research on foods, on additives, hormones, and on environmental toxins, on childhood behavior. But because in the United States there's been this reductionism to everything is a brain disorder, it leaves little room for research on other factors.
That gets me to a point here before we get into ADHD itself, and that is when I teach psychology, it's there's different areas. It seems that every theory is a religion. If you believe in the Freudian model, that's a religion to you. If you believe in B.F. Skinner and behaviorism, that's a religion as well. People will argue just as if it is a religion. It's like Catholics and Protestants. And then you get into these other models, and it's the same way. And it seems there's been a kind of a change from the in the 70s, there was sort of a fight between the behaviorist approach and the psychoanalytic. But it seems that they both lost out. Correct me if I'm wrong. They lost out to the pharmaceutical viewpoint in regards to mental disorders. And it's almost like, in the old days when a country was Catholic and then a Protestant king would come along and suddenly everyone had to be Protestant after that. I mean, Sweden, it was kind of that way, Some king decides he wants to have more control, so he becomes a Protestant, takes over the Catholic land, and now everyone has to be Protestant, and they just say, okay, we'll be Protestant now. And it seems, is it this way when it comes to psychology as well? Was this around the 70s?
Yeah, exactly. Michael, you make a really good point. I really like the analogy between religion and the schools of psychology. Because, as you say, up until 1980, the dominant dogma in this country was Freudian psychoanalytic theory or psychodynamic theory. And as you say, they were fighting it out with behaviorism. There was some influence of Carl Rogers, Rogerian psychotherapy. But, psychoanalysis had become very dogmatic and very detached from real-life problems. And so there was a kind of takeover, a reformation, if you will, of biological psychiatry, which was closely allied with the pharmaceutical industry. And the end result was that publication in 1980 of the DSM-3. The DSM-2 was mainly psychoanalytic in its orientation. It looked for psychosocial causes of children's problems in the child's family, in the child's social environment, in school. The DSM-3 was a huge change. It blamed the brain for everything. The cause of all disorders became brain chemistry.
Okay, hold on.
Not that there was any.
Just one moment. If we could back up just a second. For my listeners who don't know what the DSM is, if you could just give a quick introduction to what that is.
Sure. It's the manual that psychiatrists use to make a diagnosis. The manual. So ADHD, for example, is a diagnosis in the 4th edition of the DSM, or Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. So the DSM, by the way, it didn't exist in the DSM-3. In the DSM-3, which was published in 1980, the diagnosis was attention deficit disorder. And it listed a set of criterion by which children could be analyzed. The whole point of the DSM-3 was to get away from the dogma of psychoanalysis. And Robert Spitzer, one of the main author of the DSM-3, said that it needed to be theoretically neutral. But of course it wasn't. It just brought another dogma in, and that was the dogma of biological psychiatry.
Okay, just wanted to point this out for people. The thing is, then, you're saying that if someone's a listener right now and they were in high school, let's say in 1979, there was no such disorder as ADHD.
Correct.
Okay.
That's correct.
I wanted to get that out to people because mental disorders are different than, let's say, a strain of flu or a bacteria, because or some sort of something like epilepsy, because that's something you can say it has a history that goes who knows how far back. You could find criteria to explain it, but ADHD did not exist until someone decided to create this.
Exactly. It was a consensus of a panel of psychiatrists. A panel of psychiatrists in 1980 brought ADD into existence. A panel of psychiatrists 12 years later, who wrote the DSM-4, took ADD out of existence and created ADHD as the disorder. So with the DSM-4, ADD ceased to exist. The more famous case is about homosexuality, that in previous psychoanalytic thinking, or in the DSM-2, homosexuality was a disease. And later in the DSM-4, it was no longer a disease. The consensus was that it was on the spectrum of normal human behavior. So these so-called diseases, unlike epilepsy, for which there is a known biological cause, these mental disorders in the DSM-3, 4, and 5, which was just published a couple of weeks ago, these are just by consensus. It's a panel of psychiatrists who come to agreement on the disorders. And unfortunately, these panels have a very high rate of financial ties to the pharmaceutical industry. Mm-hmm. In the DSM-4, it was 56% of DSM-4 panelists were financially beholden to pharmaceutical companies. With the DSM-5, I think it went up 11%. Yeah. So you see, and it's very much in the interest of drug companies to have these so-called biological diagnoses, because they can supply the drugs to correct them.
Exactly. And yeah, I mean, it's interesting that, I mean, for instance, I wrote a book. I have a book series called Freedom from Conscience about a psychopathic anti-hero. And the thing is, it's interesting that there's a big fight in psychology about the way that the DSM actually classifies sociopathy, but yet it has to have certain criteria, whereas psychopathy is not actually listed in the DSM as a personality. So therefore, you have to do certain things to qualify as a sociopath. And there's actually these debates that take place in psychiatry and psychology over something that most people just use interchangeably, but yet it makes a big deal in psychology.
Exactly. It's a lot. What diagnoses become solidified and finally are accepted by the manual, the DSM, are really a matter of interest groups. You know, the French philosopher Michel Foucault said that mental health issues are mainly about power. And he couldn't be more correct, that whatever group, a subgroup in the panelists gets their way, has the loudest voice, their favorite diagnoses become included as mental disorders.
Yeah, so I use the example sometimes of, you've heard of oppositional defiant disorder.
Sure.
I mean, you talk back to your parents, you talk back to your teacher, all of a sudden you've got a psychiatric disorder.
Exactly. And you're drugged for it.
Yeah. Not even the Soviets went that far, I will note. Now, for those who have not seen the documentary, The Medicated Child, first of all, I would really encourage people to do that. It's a PBS documentary. It's you can watch online. It's produced by Frontline. Notice I give all the way, so you could just Google all those things. But The Medicated Child really opens this whole debate up, showing really extreme examples where kids are getting up in the morning and they're opening up the medicine cabinet and there's just, it looks like a pharmacy there. And first of all, what I'd like you to do is, can you maybe give us some of the criteria? So just in case some of us that are listening or might actually have ADHD and not know it, could you give us some of those criteria that can
Sure.
that can demonstrate that we may be suffering and maybe we need some drugs?
Right. Well, I'm sure we could all use them, but they're basically two parts of the criteria. There's the criteria for inattention, and then there are the criteria for hyperactivity or impulsivity. And for inattentiveness, it's a child who makes careless mistakes in his schoolwork or has difficulty paying attention in class, or doesn't always finish his homework or his schoolwork, or has difficulty organizing his tasks, or is forgetful. Those are the inattentiveness criteria.
My gosh, wasn't that Albert Einstein? I mean, you just described him when he was in grade school.
Well, yeah, it's true. I think he didn't read until age 7 or so. Mm-hmm. And really didn't want to follow the directions of the teacher. I can only imagine.
Yeah, Carl Jung was the same way.
Jung, really. Yeah, I think that it is a shame that often very creative children are diagnosed with the inattentiveness part of it because they're so bored in class, and they're given these drugs that actually stifle creativity. Stimulant drugs, the main ones that are used for ADHD, have been shown to stifle creativity in children. So inattention is the first part, and I think we've got Einstein and Jung pegged there. The second aspect of it is hyperactivity or impulsivity. So one little boy, the father came in, and his father said that his teacher thought that he was hyperactive because he fidgeted with his pencil in class. So fidgetiness or scrimminess in a seat in the classroom is an example of hyperactivity, or is someone who talks excessively in class. I mean, in my day, when I went to elementary school, children who talked excessively in class had to stand in the corner or stand in the corridor until they controlled themselves.
I love that corridor.
Yeah, I spent a little time there too. And the other part of it is impulsivity. So the child blurts out the answers before the other children, or has difficulty waiting for his turn, or interrupts others when they're talking. So those are the two parts are inattentiveness and then hyperactivity, impulsivity. And if a child has six of the symptoms of either, they qualify for the diagnosis of ADHD. And even more shockingly, recently the American Academy of Pediatrics has lowered the age limit to age 4. So if a 4-year-old can't sit still for half an hour in class, he can be labeled as ADHD and drugged with stimulant medications.
Wow.
4 years old.
I mean, I know a guy that takes people to, he takes students from Europe to spend time in Africa, because they have some sort of project going on there. And the kids in Africa, when they're learning their alphabet, when they're little, the teacher has them dance as they are reciting their alphabet.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think, this is going to really sting at Americans who generally think that America is like just a step away from godhood. I mean, I'm just going to say that because, a lot of times you'll say, hey, they do it this way over here in this country. And they're like, yeah, well, you get that answer. But the thing is, it seems like the African teachers in those areas know more about how kids actually operate than someone who thinks that a child can be programmed, especially a boy, can be, now I'm going to get the feminists mad at me, but, most diagnoses are given to boys in America. It's like 4 times more than females. To sit still.
Yeah.
I mean, nature, if you're going to go by a naturalistic model, nature designed us to be moving just like a puppy moves and plays to learn how to hunt. A kitten moves and plays to learn how to hunt. Humans are no different. I mean, we are designed to use our muscles to build us up. We don't have to get into a whole evolutionary psychology thing, but kids have a reason for moving, and that is because the skeletal structure and the muscles are having to develop as we go along. And of course, our learning is different than it was, when your father took you out and showed you how to tend the goats and, how to kill the wolf or lion if it came around to try to eat your goats or something like that. But nevertheless, that is more natural than sitting in a classroom in some schools in America, they have block schedules where you sit for 1.5 hours straight in a class of, what is it now? I mean, with budget cuts in America, I've heard of classes up to 40 for first graders.
Yeah, it's really terrible. And I think you point out something about the Africans and the children learning their alphabet. Children just have more energy than adults. And children to dance or to sing, that is a much better way to learn the alphabet, in my view, because it makes use of their childhood energy. It channels the energy into dancing, so that if they're sitting in a circle and they have to sit still and learn the alphabet, it could be more difficult than if they get up and dance and sing the alphabet.
Mm-hmm. And I've visited quite a few Chinese schools, and they start every day. You get all the students come out, and it doesn't matter whether it's grade school or whether it's high school, and they turn music on and they start doing like aerobics. Of course, they'll have banners up that reminds you it's China, respect your family, learn a lot and stuff. So you stare at those as the music's playing and you're moving. But you spend 30 minutes exercising before the school day begins.
Well, in India, the school children do yoga every day, which I think is a wonderful thing. But you brought up the numbers of boys. Yeah, it's true. 20% of boys in the United States are diagnosed with ADHD, and the number of total children is 11%. 11% of school-age children, that's 6.4 million children in the United States, are diagnosed. And that's a 41% increase in the last decade. And of course, with the increased diagnosis comes the increased use of medications, which simply control the symptoms. The medications do not treat any biological cause. They simply mute the symptoms and calm the child down. And, many times parents think that these medicines are actually treating a cause. And the analogy that a lot of the research doctors use is that it's like giving insulin for diabetes. Giving stimulant drugs like Adderall or Ritalin is like addressing the cause. And that couldn't be more incorrect. With diabetes, we know the biological cause. It's a dysfunction of the pancreas. And what you are doing is supplying the insulin that the pancreas does not make. But with giving stimulants, you're not correcting any biological cause. There's no known biological cause or laboratory test for ADHD. You're simply calming the child down by using amphetamines. And parents don't always realize, although there's a lot more publicity these days, parents are giving their children what is known on the street as speed to increase their concentration and calm down their behavior.
So it's kind of like it's kind of like if a person's staying up till 3 a.m. at a party and they drank a cup of coffee or a Mountain Dew or something, and it focuses them, essentially.
Yeah, essentially. Or it's like college students who take amphetamines to study for final exams. There's a lot of stimulant drugs going around colleges. Even in my day, it was done that you stay up all night to cram for finals, and it helps if you take some amphetamines. But that's what we're doing to 4-year-olds. It's not only being used in colleges and high schools for children to improve grades, it's being used for 4- and 5-year-olds.
Well, can you explain
so
a
that
little
they
bit?
can sit still and learn.
Can you explain a little bit then? I mean, this is one thing I've noticed that seems to be a trend. Again, it seems that America before 2000 was a different country than America after 2000. And maybe some of that had to do with 9/11. I don't know. But it seems that, or maybe we just have more information on the internet. But it seems that things are getting more and more loose when it comes to the home. Kids kind of being in charge in many ways. The advertisers use what they call, this is the actual term, the nag factor in advertising and marketing to get your kids to nag you for things, food, clothes, stuff like this. Then on top of that, the school systems are becoming even more authoritarian than they used to be. I mean, you read all the time, kid takes a bite out of a Pop-Tart and it looks like a gun, and he's 6 years old and gets suspended for a week. Some other kid holds hands with a student. Very regimented. It's almost like when we look at the Olympics, the only team in the Olympics that was dressed like military uniforms when they had the opening ceremonies was the United States.
Huh.
It seemed, yeah? I
haven't. Well, the correlation, I really haven't noticed any kind of big change as far as that kind of thing. But what I have noticed is that the classroom size is getting larger, and there's more stress on teachers. And there's also more stress on parents. With the financial downturn, their parents are working longer hours. Both parents need to work to have 2 incomes. And so the stress on the family has increased, and also the stress on the schools. And I think when kids are annoying, when they do things that annoy adults, it's more difficult for adults to tolerate when they're under severe stress.
So in other words...
And I think that has played a part.
Okay, so...
In other words, teachers want kids to be diagnosed. Teachers refer children for evaluation for ADHD because they kind of want the kid to be drugged so that they'll behave in class. And yes. Parents want their child to be diagnosed because it's a medical condition, and the medicine will sedate the child at home.
So it's if you want conformity, then this is the best way to do it. It's kind of like a Brave New World situation. But
the Soma, he didn't even have Soma for children. I'm not sure if that was Brave New World or 1984.
Now Soma was for kids. Not for kids, but it was for adults. But the thing is that then that would explain why a lot of maybe creative kids. I mean, if you're trying to give a lesson on, let's say, desert land, the desert to a bunch of 9-year-olds, and you get some kid that raises his hand constantly asking about, well, couldn't we plant those things on Mars, and couldn't we make Mars into a desert environment? And then the teacher's kind of like, Johnny, please, will you stay on the subject, okay? And this kind of frustration with this kid that's thinking ahead and actually applying information it could cause you stress.
Sure. I think it can be threatening. And so there is a lot of busy worksheets in schools. I think that do encourage conformity. I think part of this was that No Child Left Behind program that was started by the previous administration. And a lot of the result of that program was teaching to the test. And so there was this conformity to teaching to these nationally given tests by which schools were rated. And that's still going on. The vestiges of No Child Left Behind are still in the schools. And a lot of kids are complaining that they're just teaching to the tests and they don't encourage imagination in the classrooms.
Well, the interesting thing is, we have a situation now where a lot of the kids have iPhones. If they don't have iPhones, they at least have access to computers. They can get the kind of, those kind of questions that used to be given in history classes, like when was George Washington born, or what was the ship's name? What was the name of the ship that Lafayette was sailing on when he came to the American colonies? Which really mean very little if you have access to any and all information at your fingertips, but yet you're having to answer questions that are basically mean nothing whatsoever. And it seems like that's actually going to increase the problems because the kids are working at a faster rate. I know what it's like. You go on the computer and if I can't find information in 5 minutes. And I wasn't raised with the computer, so if I don't find information in 5 minutes, I get really frustrated and angry if I cannot get some information. So I can imagine with these kids that are being raised on the computer, where everything is instantaneous, and then suddenly they're in a classroom that someone's writing on the chalkboard about something that's probably not something that can be applied in real life, either philosophically or psychologically or technically. Then it just seems like this divide is going to increase more and more and more, and of course with budget cuts, our classes are growing more and more, and it's going to create more pharmaceutical answers.
Well, I think you made a good point about attention span. If you don't get the results in a very few seconds, in nanoseconds, then you sort of lose interest. And I think that kids in general have shorter attention spans than adults, and their attention spans are becoming less in a very distracted and distractible society. And so there's more propensity to drug kids to increase their attention span. But there's another downside to kids having all these iPhones and iPads and Nintendo games and video game players, and that is that parents are losing control. It's no longer a case of, well, if you don't behave in school today and you don't do your homework on time, then you can't watch TV. Well, Johnny could care less about TV because he has his video games and he has his iPhone, his texting, and his iPad. So it becomes more and more difficult for parents to get leverage. Because it used to be that TV was a big privilege in my day. And not to be able to watch American Bandstand after school would have been a huge punishment. Whereas these days, it's very difficult for parents to have any leverage, especially on teenagers.
Yeah, with the internet, they are connected immediately to anything and everything they want to. And I remember the term that was really popular, a term that went around in the 90s for educators of all levels, was that the teacher had to be competing with MTV, because you had to be entertaining to keep the students' attention. And now that's shifted to where, MTV is old tech. When you've got the the various technology that's available now. And kids, I've noticed this very interesting. You probably noticed this phenomena. 5 or 6 of them sitting at a table of all ages. I mean, it's especially true for 17, 18, 19-year-olds that I teach. They're not really interacting. They're on their iPhones doing something.
Exactly. And, this is not this is what my article, Why French Kids Don't Have ADHD. You don't see this in France. In France, you sit down to a family meal and people are not iPhoning and texting. That's not happening. The family sits down as a family and they discuss their day. And that is so rare today in the United States. If you see a family sitting down, for example, in a restaurant, everybody's on their smartphone. And so there's no sense of togetherness. There's no expectation of how young people should behave, of how teenagers should behave respectfully by paying attention to their parents. That's just gone. And in my field of family therapy, you say that there's a lack of family hierarchy. And that's one of the things I found in France that's very different. The parents are in charge. There's still a sense that the parents are in charge of the families, and the children know that, they understand that, and they're not disrespectful.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, when I've been in China, the kids are quite. I remember this when it came to when I was in this high school, and I was willing to stand in line for the lunch that was being given, and all the students actually, basically, took me by the arm and said, "No, you're the teacher," and they escorted me to the front. Uh-huh. And if you talk to them, I mean, when it comes to their parents, they don't sit around going, "Oh, my mom and dad are so uncool," and stuff. And I've tried to find articles about ADHD in China, and I can't find it. So I don't think that they're there where you do have a very strong sense of this is right, this is wrong, and so forth. I don't know if they really have it, because there is a discipline that is taught, and they're not going to suddenly just say, okay, well, here, take some drugs or something like that. They're very, I mean, even public drinking is seen as very negative in their culture. So, I mean, maybe that makes them similar to the French. I don't know about the drinking part, but when it comes to the structure in the home being so important.
Yeah, I think that it is more European, I think, to have the family meal, the structured home life, whereas in America today there's so much attention. Families have become child-centered, so that the family life revolves around soccer practice, softball practice, swim team practice, and so parents are taxi drivers basically for their children. And from Monday through Friday, and even on weekends, there's no such thing as a family dinner where everybody sits down to dinner. It's always working around the kids' schedules. And I see this as not a good thing for children. Parents should be, for a healthy child, parents need to be in charge of the kids, and not the kids' schedules or the kids' needs running the family life.
Okay, last week I interviewed a mother of 8, who was a homeschooler. Mm-hmm. Now, what do you see? I mean, I'm sure you've seen this issue with ADHD, and then maybe some parents go for homeschooling in the United States. What have you seen in regards to that?
Well, I have gotten over the years, since my book, Pills Are Not for Preschoolers, was published last year, I have gotten a lot of emails from parents who say that their child qualified for the ADHD diagnosis when they were in school. And rather than drug them with medication, the parents took them out of the classroom and put them in homeschool. And they were no longer ADHD. with the lack of distractions in the classroom, with an appropriate amount of attention from the teacher, in this case the parent, with a quiet, non-stimulating environment, the child no longer had the mental disorder. So I've had a lot of, I don't know the statistics, but I've had a lot of parents write to me and tell me that homeschooling saved their child from an ADHD diagnosis and medication. Also, another thing is that the appropriateness of the teacher. One parent whose son in kindergarten wouldn't go to school, and the psychiatrist diagnosed the child with school phobia and wanted to medicate him, and the mother wasn't comfortable with this, so she went to observe in the classroom, and she felt that the teacher was unnecessarily strict for kindergarten and wasn't always sensitive to the child's feelings. She took her son out of that school, put him in a different school, and the school phobia disappeared. He no longer had the mental disorder.
But wait, I thought, if the school phobia has something to do with a brain disorder, the brain was still the same in both schools.
Exactly, and that I think is the main point of all of this, that social environment can affect behavior. It can even affect the brain. If we are with the wrong spouse, we can become depressed and unhappy, and our neurotransmitters are changed. The biochemistry of the brain is changed by our social environment. So that the cause is outside rather than inside. And especially with children who are very sensitive to their social environment.
So in the remaining few minutes here, I want you to tell me, you've got a child that's displaying some problems in Paris, France.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I know, anyone wants to see how it's dealt with in America. In the amount of time we have here, just watch The Medicated Child on PBS.
Right.
You'll see it.
Right.
But you're a little worried that your kid's, squirming around in class and being disruptive to other kids. So you go in, and what's going to happen? What's going to happen in Paris?
Well, in Paris, I haven't been there in 20 or 30 years, actually, but because the psychoanalytic tradition is very strong, and the biological psychiatry did not have a coup d'etat in the 1980s, French psychiatry refused to go to the biological model, the psychiatrist would look at psychosocial factors, and that is there discipline in the home? Do parents agree about discipline? Or are the parents having problems? Are they fighting in front of the child? The number one cause, I hate to say it, but the number one stimulus for child problems is parents who are fighting or disagreeing at home in front of the child. When parents stop doing that, it's almost like magic. The child shapes up. So the psychiatrist would look at, are the grandparents over-involved in the family? That's a big problem. Mauro Pellizzoli, the Italian psychiatrist, found that grandparent meddling or intrusiveness into the marital relationship was a cause of severe problems in children, such as autism. And certainly in ADHD, if a grandparent is siding with one parent over the other. So, long story short, in France, doctors are going to first look at the child's social environment, the child's parents, the child's family. Is someone in the family ill? Is the child responding to a mother who's in the hospital, a grandmother who just died? Does the child have a mean teacher? These are the sorts of things that the child psychiatrist is going to look for. As opposed to in the United States, there's very little attention given to the psychosocial environment. It's all about a checklist of symptoms. Does the child have inattentiveness for 6 months? Does the child fidget in class for 6 months? And they kind of go down to this checklist of symptoms. And that is, the attempt was to have a neutral, non-dogmatic way of assessing mental health diagnoses, but in fact it's just become another religion, another dogma, which is the biological pharmaceutical model. Mm-hmm. So I hope I've been clear about the difference in the way that a psychiatrist would look at the child's problem.
Yes, very clear. Now, one last thing. Economically, ethnically, and so forth, in the United States, what seems to be the most, is it like working class, poor, middle class, upper middle class? Which kids get the diagnosis the most?
Okay. I'm really glad you asked that question. Poor children are 4 times as likely to be diagnosed and drugged than middle-class children. There was a study by Rutgers University, and one of the reasons for that is that
we got 30 seconds. So
okay, poor kids are drugged more than middle-class and well-to-do children in this country, and that's because Medicaid social programs pay for drugs and psychiatry and not for family therapy or talk therapy. Okay. So there's a real inequality in the amount of drugging that's going on.
Very, very interesting. Very, very good insights. You've been an excellent guest tonight. Thank you very much for coming on, Marilyn.
It's been a pleasure, Michael.
And what was the name of that book there that you want people to check out?
Pills Are Not for Preschoolers, a drug-free approach for troubled children.
Okay.
Yeah.
Very, very good there. And I'd hope people would check that book out because it'll give you some insights that maybe the multi-billion-dollar pharmaceutical industry would rather you not be exposed to. Anyway, well, thank you. And this wraps up another evening for Unlock the Door. This is your host, Michael Cross, saying good evening and hope you'll tune in next week.